everyone, and welcome back into the Weather Lounge. I'm your host, meteorologist Michael Prianti. This podcast comes to you from our WeatherWorks headquarters here in Hackettstown, New Jersey. And joining me today is fellow meteorologist, the one, the only, Jen Diorio. Jen, it's good to hear you and good to see you on the podcast.
Good to see you too, Mike. How's everything been going?
Oh, not too bad. I know filling in for Brad here, but I think it's going to be a really interesting episode today. One that I think I'm going to enjoy a lot. I don't know about you, but really good topic.
I've been looking forward to this for a while, so I am very excited.
Yes, of course. So we're going to be bringing in two special guests today, and I think Jen can introduce one of them that
Sure.
Both Jen and I know very well.
Yes, definitely. So one of our guests today is someone who I can personally say had a major influence on both my college and professional journey, Dr. John Nese. I had the privilege of taking his classes back in the day, if you will. It's already been 5 years since I graduated, which is crazy. But I can honestly say that Dr. Nese's passion for weather and teaching, especially in my introductory meteorology and senior forecasting classes, helped shape the path that I'm on today. So Dr. Nese is currently a teaching professor and the associate head for undergraduate programs in Penn State's Department of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science. He previously worked as a storm analyst on the Weather Channel and is currently a familiar face to many as the host of a television broadcast called WeatherWorks, airing on WPSU and the Pennsylvania Cable Network. But today, he's here to discuss a brand new book titled The Weather Gods Curse the Gettysburg Campaign, which was just published this past June and explores the weather's role on one of the most pivotal events in American history. I've been reading it. I'm almost done. I'm a slow reader. Mike, I know that you read it as well.
Yes,
and it's been great. So exciting read. I love weather focused books, and then to put it on one of the most monumental events in American history. It's just been
right.
So
and I
amazing
actually
to
have the
read.
book here today here. So I really enjoyed the book, all the way from the beginning to the end, especially the weather section. I can't stress that enough, the weather section. But of course, I am a meteorologist, so if that doesn't ring true, then we have a problem there.
Right.
Of course,
if we
also
don't like weather-related things, we might be in the wrong field.
Right, maybe I'm not in the right section here. But we can't forget to introduce the other special guest today, the co-author of the book. His name is Jeffrey Harding, and I think he knows a little thing or two about the American Civil War, because he is and currently is a licensed battlefield guide for over 21 years at the Gettysburg National Military Park. And before that, he served as an intelligence analyst and a professional development specialist with the Office of Naval Intelligence. So he's got a lot going on there, but we're glad to have him on with Dr. John Nese. And guys, thanks for joining us here.
Thanks for having us.
It's good to see both of you again. Thanks for having us.
Of course. So I guess I'll start here, before we go into the book a little bit. What I want to really find out here is kind of what was the inspiration to really talk about, the Civil War? Like, what was the main thing, whether it's you, John, or Jeff, who brought it up first to talk about, to kind of go more into what was the idea behind talking a little bit about weather and the Civil War?
I guess I should take that lead, huh, John?
Sure.
Yeah. So as a guide, we get asked all the time about the weather during the battle. And it was something I was curious about. Actually, my wife's a huge fan of all things weather. And she would ask me the same thing. She'd say, hey, you're telling me you know something about the temperatures. And we knew a little bit about that because there was a weather observer in town, Professor Jacobs, actually part of the Smithsonian Meteorological Project. But we didn't have any heat index information. And of course, they weren't doing heat index back then in the mid-19th century. But there were some that were observing atmospheric moisture. Unfortunately, Jacobs did not. So I was curious what we could get out of what his records did show. When I located the primary source documents, I turned to John because I'm a history guy, a lot of things. I'm not a meteorologist and certainly appreciate weather, and had looked at some of John's prior work. and thought he'd be a good one to reach out to say, hey, looking at these records, is there anything here that'll give us heat index? So the fateful phone call that we always tease about, I called up to thank him, for all his great work that led me down the road to discovering this Smithsonian project and what Jacobs was actually doing. But then John took it from there as far as telling me what I needed.
Wow. That's really interesting. And John yourself, I mean, you sort of, I mean, you're the mastermind behind the weather with this book. And what sort of, I guess, kind of brought you into it? Have you been a fascination with history all your life? Is there something with a connection between Gettysburg? Like, why Gettysburg?
Well, I remember visiting Gettysburg. My dad was an American history teacher in high school, and he took us there when I was little. But the intersection between weather and history has always fascinated me. It fascinated me in particular because I worked at the Franklin Institute Science Museum in Philadelphia for 5 years, and it's hard to get away from history when you work in a place like that. It's been around since the 1820s. Spent so many hours in the library there, wrote a book about the history of Philadelphia weather. And so I'd always had this fascination with the overlap of weather and history, and Gettysburg had been one of those topics because the battle was fought in early July, and a lot had been written about that because of that weather observer that was in Gettysburg, but there were still a lot of holes to fill in. And so when Jeff called, it seemed like a natural extension to try to find out what else we could learn, and that led us originally to a paper that we published in 2022, and then the book that came out this year.
I see. Okay. So there was a paper before the book came out. There was something predecessor to the book.
Yeah, the paper was published in Gettysburg Magazine in July of 2022. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Jeff. I think that's correct.
Right.
But we focused solely on the battle. So we looked at that 3-day period.
Okay.
And presented new information about what we thought the heat index was that had never been published before. And some folks took an interest in that. We gave a talk at something called the Civil War Institute in Gettysburg in the summer of 2023. There was a lot of interest. And then somehow Jeff convinced me to write a book.
The rest is history.
Literally. Yes, for sure.
I should have gone into sales, huh, John?
All right, that's really interesting. It was almost like the success of the paper and the talk led to the book, and then obviously the book covers the time period before and after the battle and gives more context, which is great.
That's right.
Exactly.
Jeff had kind of convinced me, and I'd looked at that developments that folks are always writing new things about the Civil War, and the Battle of Gettysburg in particular is a topic about which much has been written. Mm-hmm. But I think what we have done I hate to pat ourselves on the back, but it's a big leap. I mean, some people have told us that what we've done advances the knowledge about the battle and the campaign more than just about anything that's been done in recent years, which kind of makes me proud that we went on this journey and have been able to add, because so much has been written about the logistics of the battle and many other topics surrounding the battle, but not that much has been written about the weather.
Right. And, like you said, there's been so much talk and so many historical books and references and guides. And I mean, you go back 100 years plus and, people know exactly what happened during the Battle of Gettysburg. But of course, the weather is just something that people, of course, back in the day, we didn't have satellite. We didn't have radar in the mid 1800s. So all we had were stories, and we had maybe crudely drawn maps. And of course, there were some observers, and that's really where a lot of that really kind of came from. So I guess before we go into that, one more question I want to have with Jeff. What got you into sort of being a battle guide? Like what goes into that? Because you've been doing this for over 21 years, but you were before at the Naval office. So what got you into this role here?
Yeah, well, it's funny because listening to John talk about his dad, my interest in history actually started with my mother. She
Mm.
was a teacher in Maryland and elementary school and taught fourth grade. In fourth grade Maryland, I think like a lot of states, you learn your particular state's history. And so during the summers, she would go to historic sites all around the state. I was the youngest kid, so I got to go along, couldn't stay home by yourself. But that love of history began to take root right then. Get distracted, you get into your teens and different things. But went to college, and boy, I just had an outstanding teacher, Dr. Jim Terry, and he lit the fires again, my interest in history. And then raising a family, so some of that subsided one more time. But we happened to watch a program. It was back when mini-series were all that, back in the 1980s, and it was the North and South. You probably know the name Patrick Swayze. He was the big star in the movie.
Yep.
Anyway, said to my wife, we had a daughter at the time who just turned 1. I said, we need to get away a little bit. It's only a couple hours up the road from where we lived in Maryland. Let's go to Gettysburg. And boy, when I went there, I was just like, God, this place is something. There's something special here. I came home, went right to the library, got a stack of like 20 books, and I was off and running. And then I learned about the guiding force and decided that would be something that would be neat. Wonderful retirement job in theory. You work any day you want, work as many hours as you want. What could be better? And you're doing something you love. And kind of got the cart in front of the horse. Actually, the year 2000 is when I started. And so I just entered what's called the part of your career where you don't have any certain amount of tours you have to do. I'm in my 26th year, actually, my 26. So,
Wow.
yeah, I don't know where time goes, but that's how it is
Time
when
just
you
flies.
retire.
I get it. Yeah.
Time flies when you're having
Yeah, I'm an
fun.
emeritus guide finally. Yeah, big deal, but I'm still doing it and still love it, of course.
Well, that's great. Well, that's awesome.
Yeah,
You got to
that's
do what you love
fantastic.
sometimes, what you do,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
you love it,
exactly.
time goes by and, you never miss it.
Never work a day in your life if you love what you're doing. That's exactly right.
Exactly.
Yes,
That's
I'm blessed in
exactly.
that regard.
Yes. So I guess now
Want to
let's
get into
dive.
the book?
Yeah, I think we should go into the
Yeah.
book. I know we're talking so much about other things, but I think what the listeners want to hear about right now is kind of the book, and I'm also really excited to learn a little more and talk a little bit with the two authors of the book, of course.
Yes.
So really, I guess the one thing that I really want to kind of know right now is sort of like what were the main insights that you I guess took away from like the big key thing after going through all the data and going through everything leading up to the book. What did you both find that was spectacular, something that you've never heard of before relating to the Gettysburg Campaign, things that you've never heard about and seen in books?
What do you say, John? You can take it.
So I think that we came to the conclusion that the time of the campaign was one that included some fairly unusual weather occurrences.
Mm-hmm.
And that if the folks who were directing the campaign, the generals, had known that some of these things were going to happen, which of course they didn't have weather forecasts, they may have changed the way they approached what they did. I mean, there was a heat wave, and this had been written about. It was not a surprise. There was a heat wave in the middle of June as the armies were moving north through Virginia. And the soldiers wrote eloquently about how terrible it was. Well, we tried to quantify it. And we found that it's reasonable to believe that there were heat indices that occurred during this heat wave that exceeded 110 degrees. And if that were to happen modern day, I mean, that's a very high heat index. And we even computed an additional measure called the wet bulb globe temperature, which provides insight into how much water people should drink and how much rest they should have if the value of this index reaches high enough. And there were situations where these soldiers are just not hydrated and they're out in the sun and they're falling to the wayside from sunstroke. And now we can quantify that. Now we can legitimize what the soldiers wrote about by saying, yeah, you know what? It was pretty bad. So there was that heat wave. And then we also learned some new things about the retreat. When the armies left Gettysburg, the Confederates were trying to get back to the safety of Virginia. They had to cross the Potomac, and the water was too high, and Lee was effectively trapped for about a week and couldn't cross. And so we tried to quantify how much rain would have fallen and what the river looked like at that time. So I think those were two of the biggest contributions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And for historians,
sorry,
it's
go ahead,
critical.
Jeff.
I'm sorry, Jen.
No,
It's
go
just,
ahead. Go
you
ahead.
can't really understate because with that heat wave in the middle of June, we'd known there were some temperatures in the 90s, but we had no idea it was as bad heat index wise. And as you all well know, the National Weather Service will tell you that that's a shade measurement too, just like regular temperature. And so you go out in the sun, you're going to add another 10, 15 degrees, depending on circumstances, how cloudy it might be, what the winds are, etc., which comes into your wet bulb measurements. But this was as dreadful as you could imagine, and it helps us understand better something like if you go to a document called the Medical Surgical History of the United States Civil War, for the month of June, the Union Army that's moving out of Virginia up towards Pennsylvania through Maryland represents about 20% of all Union armies across the country. They suffered during June of 1863, 60% of all reported cases of sunstroke. They called it more frequently than heat stroke. But these are periods of long marches, similar impact on the Confederate Army, I'm sure, because these armies are moving 15, 20, sometimes 25 miles a day during this terrific heat. And as John said, they're not getting the hydration they should be getting, not getting the rest. And the consequences are they're going to lose a lot of men. Guys are going to fall out left and right. Many will die, sadly. So it's helps us better understand the suffering level of what these guys are going through. And then for the period of the battle, we had learned that the heat index during July 2nd, the second day of the battle, July 3rd, was worse than had been anticipated, certainly worse than what the temperatures had indicated. Day 2 of the battle, 81 degrees. Doesn't sound too terrible, but we're looking at a heat index that day around 90. Again, shade measurement. What's the sun doing to it? And you have contingents of both armies marching great distances that day, hard pressed to get to the field. And in one particular group, the Confederate group, they marched about 20 miles to get to the field. They march another 6, 7, 8 miles to get in position for the attack. They turn out to be the tip of the spear. They're going to launch the assault that day. No one would have ever planned that, knowing what they've been through, but like it or not, they've got to do it. And then they attack across some of the worst ground on the battlefield. In fact, the highest hill on the battlefield, they've got to go up it, fighting against sharpshooters. They get to the top of the hill. They're so exhausted. The regimental commander gives the guys a break. It's a 10-15-minute break. In that 10 or 15 minutes, previously unoccupied Little Round Top, the left flank of the Union Army, is now occupied. So does heat play a role? Yes, we knew that this was all happening. We didn't quite understand how much the heat contributed to it. And then on the third day of the battle, you had Pickett's charge. And we had known it was 87 degrees in the shade at 2 o'clock. But the charge starts at 3. The thought had always been later in the afternoon, a little warmer. But we had no idea the heat index was anywhere from 98 to 105. And so how did that play a role? And this opens conversations again for the interpretation for historians. So that's why this was so important.
Wow.
I think one of the things, I don't do well in high heat. And as I'm reading the book, the uniforms is the thing that got me like the most, because we all know you can be out in these high heat indices and even just the light clothes you're wearing can feel like too much. And now these men are wearing wool, mostly wool. I know they differed from the Union to the Confederate, but still long sleeves, long pants, just this clothing that's just going to seal in that heat and absorb that sun. That just stood out to me. And another thing that really stood out to me, in addition to, these men are sometimes marching, I think the one chapter of the book said like 32 to 34 miles or something in one day was the one, army group. But they're carrying their gear, which was around, I think it said 40 pounds, which is just an insane amount to carry in cool weather, then throw the uniforms, then throw in the heat. I mean, I'm honestly surprised that as many men made it as they did. I know many did, fall ill and pass from sunstroke, but these were that was quite the human endurance, and I know you guys said that in the book. Just to be able to withstand that is crazy.
No, it's
Right.
good to hear that conveyed because
Yeah.
we wanted to make that point. You're exactly right.
So I can't complain when I'm hot.
No, I think you got to look at it from their perspective. Like you
Yeah.
said,
And they got undergarments on too. It's just
yeah. Plus
Yeah.
how did they
that,
do it?
right, right. So
And of course, there's no escaping because their shelter is the environment. They are living in that environment. You can't go inside to the air conditioning for 10 minutes and cool down.
No.
The water they're often getting is coming from streams and creeks that could have been used for men to bathe in. And so often even the water they're getting isn't
Quality.
particularly quality water.
Yeah. Yeah, they're
right.
not putting any electrolyte powder in there, that's for sure.
No. No, there's no Gatorade in the mid 1800s,
No, no.
unfortunately.
And the
So,
same thing, even when, reading about the rain too, same thing like you just said, John, of that there's no escaping the rain. So now they're sleeping in their wet clothes in a puddle potentially. Like it's just they were exposed to the elements 24/7.
Right.
right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's one
And not
quote
just
in the
rain
book where,
too. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jeff.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mike. Go, Mike.
No, I was going to say not just rain too, but of course there were times when there were dangerous weather like thunderstorms. I know there were mentions from some of the soldiers' accounts of hail too. So not just the fact that it was hot, humid, there was rain, but there's other elements. Strong winds, thunderstorms, branches. Thunderstorms that are severe could bring down trees and lightning strikes that are also adding to that fact too. They're in the elements, right? There's no shelter. There's no buildings to save them. So not only do you have to fight all of that, but you also have to contend with what Mother Nature's giving you from thunderstorms.
Yeah, and this is actually a good segue to mention that, I mean, Jen, Mike, you know that as meteorologists, we take great pride in making accurate weather observations.
Mhm.
Not that the general public doesn't, but when you read the writings that have been left behind about the weather, sometimes you wonder if they're embellishing and, accurately conveying what was going on. And I lead with that because I want to point out, I think one of the major contributions that we've brought to bear here is that we used a data source that had been largely unutilized to this point, and that is at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. There were, as professional as you can get, weather observers at the time who were taking extensive weather observations every 3 hours. So you have 8 observations a day of everything a meteorologist would want. Plus, they would scribble little notes about the time things started, size of hail, etc. And so what we have is this very credible source, which you might say, but that was in Washington, D.C. That doesn't necessarily convey what was happening where the soldiers were. And that is certainly true. But a little bit of extrapolation is generally okay in many situations as long as you do it carefully. And so that Naval Observatory data was pivotal to what we did.
Right. And I think I was going to talk about this actually right after this, so you're spot on with this segue. But I was going to mention a little more about the observations that you both looked at for this book. And, obviously back in the mid 1800s, like I mentioned earlier, you don't have a million mesonet stations. You don't have METARs, you don't have satellite, you don't have radar, but you do have a couple of stations, or I guess weather observers, and a lot of the accounts of soldiers, which you did mention, John, that could they have been embellished? Could they have been really trying to exaggerate what the weather was like? How difficult was that, or I guess going through all the data to try to figure out, okay, what was accurate and what was not?
Well, the Smithsonian, which was founded in the 1850s, had organized a network of weather observers. Now, many of them went dark in the South during the Civil War. But in the North, on the other hand, you did have observers in Frederick, Maryland, Sykesville, Maryland, Gettysburg, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. So widely dispersed, but enough to kind of get the idea of what was going on, particularly as the armies came north into Maryland and Pennsylvania.
Okay. And another thing too, we're on the topic of observations in the book, and Jen, I know you probably have seen this as well. There was a really extensive reanalysis, the NOAA reanalysis. So talk a little bit about that. Was this something that you both came up with and sort of like from scratch? Was there data used from NOAA? Was there something already in place? Like, was there already a system to reanalyze these, to go back in time? I mean, reconstructing the weather 150 plus years ago, I mean, let alone reconstructing the weather 10 years ago is not always that easy. So how did you both go about doing this? I mean, that's an impressive feat to try to analyze and say this is what it looked like from looking at all the maps that are in the book too, which are very interesting as well. How did you both go ahead and do that?
So the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration deserves all the credit. I mean, let's be clear, this called the reanalysis system is essentially a computer program developed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Okay.
It had been in the the idea behind reanalysis is pretty simple. Let's pull all the data that we have and try to come up with our best guess at what the weather map looked like at a particular time in the past. That's the idea. And the notion of extending this back in time into the 19th century had been on some researchers' minds for a couple decades. But relatively recently, within the last decade, that has been accomplished. And so basically, this is a computer program online. Anybody can access it. You pick the date, and it'll reconstruct a map of pretty much whatever variable you want. Some are more accurate than others, but as Jen and Mike, you both know, at the heart of all of it is air pressure. Mm-hmm. Because if you remember your studies, and I'm sure you do.
Oh, yes.
If you know the air pressure and you know the rate at which the pressure is changing over time, you can reconstruct a lot of other stuff, such as the wind and the general temperature pattern and the upper air winds. And that's what this reanalysis system does. And all we did was tap into it.
Okay. And this analysis system, like, what has this been around for a very long time? Is this something that was developed the past 5, 10, 15 years ago? What I'm trying to get about here is, would this reanalysis of the Civil War, of this battle in particular, been possible, let's say 10 or 15 years ago? Or is this something that we now have more technology to allow us to reanalyze this?
Well, some of it is technology and some of it is just advances in the science. Yeah. But the whole reanalysis idea has been around for a couple decades.
Okay.
Extending it back into the 19th century is a relatively recent, say, within the last decade development. And the last time I checked, you can go back to 1836.
Wow.
Now, let's be careful. It's not gospel, it's just guidance.
Right.
So to emphasize that idea, NOAA also includes a measure of uncertainty with all of the maps. to give you a sense of how far off this could be.
Okay. Yeah, and I think what you said there, John, was very important, and that's especially even into today's time. You know, we look at computer models as guidance. You know, they are not
Yep.
gospel. They are not the above all be all. And I guess with maps that go back that far, there's going to be gaps in the data. There's going to be things that people didn't really at the time. You know, the science of meteorology has expanded and has evolved in the past 200 years. So things
Yeah.
back then may not have been understood as we understand them now. So certainly there's going to be gaps and misunderstandings in that kind of data.
And I think the reanalysis of past weather has, like you said, John, become more and more prevalent in our fields within the last several years. I mean, even just in the last couple of years that I can recall, forensic meteorology is becoming, I'm sure some of our listeners have heard that term thrown around. We do that at WeatherWorks, past weather reports and forensic meteorology, but that's becoming more and more prevalent. And using tools like this from NOAA, this reanalysis type of system, is so useful for even just things that have happened, last year, 5 years ago, but even as far back as 1836, you said, and the Civil War. So,
And just to be clear, the reanalysis is most useful when one looks at the big picture, sort of where are the big waves in the atmosphere. The reanalysis is not going to answer the question, what was the temperature
right.
at 3 p.m. in the middle of the field where Pickett's charge took place in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? That's not what it's for. It's to kind of lay the big groundwork so that a meteorologist looking at the situation can use it to say, yeah, I can kind of understand why the soldiers said that. I can kind of see how this explains why it rained in Washington, D.C. that night, because the reanalysis suggests that there might have been a cold front going through. That's the information it provides, not the details
Right.
that, when you mentioned, Jen, the work WeatherWorks might do, you may literally be asked to provide information about whether ice could have formed
Yeah.
in that
Very
parking,
specific.
right, at that time on that morning. And that's not what we're doing in 1863.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it's more of the big picture type of view. And then where you guys got more into the specifics is from those observers and the observatory and things like that.
Right.
Okay.
And we had a great blend because we had that overarching NOAA program, but then we had the data from the different sites,
Right.
especially, like John said, the gold mine there, so to speak, at the observatory. And then we had these accounts from the soldiers, which, we wanted to be able to take a look at and make sense of. And so John had those three things at his disposal when he got into his laboratory and made his giant maps, which I'd love to hear about, and looked at all of this. You got one, Candy, John?
Oh, there he goes.
There you go. I've never seen these, by the way. John and
Oh.
I've only met in person twice. It's just
Oh,
insane.
wow.
These are my
Look at
maps.
this.
Well, it's an exclusive
Oh,
look here in the Weather
wow.
Lounge.
Ah,
Wow.
There's a bunch of them.
Wow.
Oh my
there's a
gosh.
bunch of them.
One,
The-
I'm making a fool out of myself here. One
No.
for each day.
That's awesome.
No.
I love
See,
it.
this is the behind the scenes content you're not going to hear about when you
That's
read
right.
the book. You're going to
That's
see
right.
it right here,
That's right.
Yeah,
here in the
right
Weather
there.
Lounge.
The
This is
making of
great.
the book. This is
Yes.
it.
This
You're the
happens-
only ones that have this.
That happens
Trust
to
me.
be June 28th, for what it's worth.
Wow.
Oh, that's a
Wow.
huge day, too. That's when
Oh,
Meade
yeah.
takes over.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
when Lee finds out the Union Army's hard on his heels, that's the best day you could have pulled, John. That's a good one. And I mean, these accounts are crazy, and
Yeah.
we hope that people, when they read these quotes in the book and realize we had over 1,500 accounts. We spent a lot of time researching this, and to pull out the ones we wanted to use to support what John was basically saying, more or less had happened with the weather. It wasn't easy, because on any given day, he might have 30 quotes. All right, which one
Wow.
are you using? They're all
Right.
very descriptive.
Well,
Yeah.
and
Some of
and to Jeff's credit, I mean, he created a Word document that in the original font size had about 450 pages of a Word document.
Oh my gosh.
And these are simply quotes that had something to do with the weather for every day from essentially June 1st to July 15th of 1863. And so what I did is I looked at all of them And on those maps I just showed you, each quote, we knew to some extent where the soldier was, because we knew which corps he was in, perhaps which regiment, and the maps that I had at my disposal showed where the various corps were on those given days. And so you could approximately determine where that soldier was on the map. And so I would simply take the quotes that Jeff had extracted and write little notes on the map. And you have to be clear here, the soldiers didn't have instruments. They didn't. So I'm literally writing qualitative things, not quantitative things. And then you pair that with the few numbers that we had at the various observing sites, and then you pair that with the reanalysis maps from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and then you begin to kind of see the big picture. Why were the soldiers saying that? Oh, I think I can explain that. For example, and it really was an exercise in forensic meteorology.
Right.
And it's also like we mentioned earlier, with the whole making things a little more exaggerated as they were. It's also figuring out like who, and you could probably tell when you go through each account, you're thinking, well, this person said the same thing on this day and it was completely different. Who's right? Right.
Well, it's funny. There was one guy, I won't mention his name, where he basically wrote the same thing every day.
Oh, wow.
And one day I said to Jeff, I don't think we can trust this guy.
Yeah.
And I tended to put a little bit more weight on the things that, for example, the surgeons who were traveling with the armies would say, knowing that they perhaps had some background in science, and thus maybe they're a little more credible.
Okay. Oh, that makes sense. And now, Jeff, where did you to have 450 pages of quotes? Where did all of these quotes come from? Where did you extract them from?
So those are going to come 9 times out of 10. These were primary source accounts. So guys' diaries. In the Civil War, if you were in the 1st Pennsylvania Infantry, there's somebody that acted as a historian and wrote what's called a regimental history. So you can go back to the regimental history. When the different regiments dedicated their monuments at Gettysburg, there would be speeches and guys would talk about things. So there are documents that contain all of these as well. So bottom line is you want to go back as much as possible to the earliest or most timely accounts, because you get 30 years away. You're talking about the snowstorm that happened, 30 years ago. How's your memory compared to the storm that happened yesterday? And so we tried to emphasize that. But I went back to as many letters, different things like that I could, and really depended heavily on a lot of wonderful archivists all across the country to different libraries that send you these letters and then give you chills. Like one resurfaced not long ago, and I sent it to John again, and it was a quote that actually we didn't use in the book, but it just stops you in your tracks, some of these things. And then we discovered there was a historical society out in the Shenandoah Valley that had a diary of a gentleman who had a farm out there. He had a winery at Front Royal, and his son was killed not far from where they lived. And in his diary, he's writing every day about the weather, because when you're farming, right, weather is everything. And then all of a sudden he has that entry about his son dying. And I knew right then, this has got to be in the book. This has got to be in the book. So it's in there.
Right. And these were real people, this isn't, fiction, these were actual accounts from the battle. So just hearing about it just kind of almost brings you into the story, or I guess the time setting even more. So I think that's something that I really enjoyed about the book. It's not just talking about the history of it. Any book can talk about the Gettysburg battle, right? You can go into any library everywhere, like we mentioned. It's everywhere. It's accounted for. But taking the weather and then also combining it with the accounts from the actual soldiers to kind of figure out the story of what happened. I think that's genius. I think that's really, really interesting how this came about.
Well, it's kind of you to say. Thank you, Mike.
Of course,
it's a labor of love.
That's the best part. Like you said, when you love it, you don't work a day in your life. It just comes naturally.
Well, I was
One
so
other,
blessed, John
yeah.
came along for the ride because he's a busy man. He's teaching television show, and he's got
Oh
a
yeah,
wife, right? And it just has been so satisfying and an honor to work with John on this. It really has.
of course. Now another thing I didn't mention in the beginning, but I know this is probably one of the more extensive research topics that about the weather of Gettysburg. Has there been something in the past that was attempted but wasn't to the extent, or is this really the first time that anyone has really looked into the weather at Gettysburg? Has there been other attempts in the past?
John, you want to talk about Ludlam?
In 1960, a very famous weather historian by the name of David Ludlam, who actually uh, started the magazine called WeatherWise, which is
Oh
still
wow,
going today,
yeah.
popular weather magazine. He wrote about the weather of the battle in an article in 1960. And I would say his was probably the most authoritative uh, that had been done. But since that time, the weather of the battle has been mentioned in a variety of books, of course. His account is often referenced, but uh, I think it's important to mention, and we haven't said this yet. What got Jeff and I started on this was this whole heat index thing, the idea that no one had ever tried to estimate the heat index during the battle, and that's because the gentleman who was observing the weather in Gettysburg during the battle, Professor Michael Jacobs, on the faculty of Pennsylvania College, now Gettysburg College, didn't have the instrument that allows us to measure humidity. And you guys both know it's called a psychrometer, which allows you to estimate things such as the dew point. And he didn't have the instrument. And so no one could estimate the heat index because we didn't have that humidity data for Gettysburg. And all we did is recognize that there were observers in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, just up the road, about 35 miles. During the battle, Harrisburg and Gettysburg were kind of in the same air mass. In other words, if you were in Gettysburg and you were in Harrisburg at the same time, it would feel about the same. And so all we did is we extrapolated the humidity information from Harrisburg and we used it in Gettysburg. And that's how we got the heat index in Gettysburg, which no one had ever done before. No one had ever utilized nearby weather observations to try to make conclusions about what happened during the battle. And so that opened the door to this whole new avenue of exploring the weather of the battle and the campaign.
Wow.
That's
Wow.
a good point. And I can not speak to why others hadn't been curious about that. To me, the heat index is so important. You need to know that. And
Right.
I was curious about it.
Yeah, and I mean,
needed
I've
that.
said this to Jeff. I'll say it to you. There were two things that made me scratch my head when it came to doing this work. One was why no one had thought to just see if there were any other observations near Harrisburg that could give them information about Gettysburg. And secondly, why no one ever noticed this gold mine of observations coming out of Washington, D.C. and the Naval Observatory.
Yeah.
There's a very famous book about Civil War weather in Virginia, and the person that wrote that book does use observations from Washington, D.C., but they come from a different observer at Georgetown. And this observer only observed the weather 3 times a day. And furthermore, the observer at the Naval Observatory, he gave us another piece of information that both of you will agree is important. They had a maximum minimum thermometer at the Naval Observatory, so they could actually tell us what the highest and lowest temperature was every day. All of these other observers, they did not have max min thermometers. They only observed the weather 3 times a day at 7 a.m., 2 p.m., and 9 p.m., which isn't enough to really characterize the day as a whole because you don't know what the high and the low were.
Right.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And how about, John, the sun temperature? Because with Jen talking about the uniforms and the heat.
Right. The folks at the Naval Observatory also made a very unusual observation. There was a thermometer placed just a couple inches above the ground on the grounds of the Naval Observatory in the sun.
Mm.
So that thermometer is essentially measuring what it felt like in the sun a couple inches above the ground. Now think about this. You have Civil War soldiers who are often asked to lay on the ground and wait, perhaps for hours, they told us during the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, in the sun. Wonder what it felt like for them. Oh, wow. We have this measurement at the Naval Observatory doing just that.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm
And that's a big difference in your measurement of that
Right.
measurement versus 2 p.m. on a day somewhere of, the temperature there is, and from the shade. So that's a big difference.
right.
Exactly.
Right.
Huge difference. Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, I think also too, I think the reason, and this is just my theory as to why it was never even looked at, was probably because when people think of like, weather and in situ weather, they think of observations at the site, right? They don't think about, well, this was in Washington, D.C. Gettysburg was nowhere near Washington, D.C. But you have to think of the big picture, right? You have to think of like the air mass that was involved. And that's where meteorologists come in and realize, well, the air mass is not usually different that far away. Usually it's the same. So, I think that's where you guys both come in. You're like, well, let's take a look at it a little more. We can actually use this data.
Right. You can make some reasonable inferences. I also think the data is not easily found. Jeff did a lot of the legwork here in finding the Naval Observatory data, and we got a lot of help from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a woman by the name of Janet Wall. I
Great.
believe I got her name right. Jeff
You
helped
did.
us out considerably in finding this data. So you do have to be kind of dogged. I mean, I remember my days at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. I would walk down to the American Philosophical Society library right down by where the Liberty Bell is displayed, and you just have to dig into the old numbers and look for the original records. And I guess another way to look at this is I don't think another book has been written about the Civil War that's been co-authored by a meteorologist. I could be wrong about that. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I'm not aware of one.
Right.
So
I'm not either.
some of the books may have consulted with a meteorologist, but when a meteorologist is actually writing the book, my name's on it. So anything that is omitted that's weather related, that's my responsibility. So I think there was a heightened level of responsibility here to make sure we turned over as many rocks as we could.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so many historians over the years had relied upon Jacobs, but indirectly. Actually, his son in 1885 wrote an account of the weather during the battle. It was in a Gettysburg newspaper. His son had a copy of his dad's original records. The other copy was with the Smithsonian, but he used that as his basis. But I wanted to see the real McCoy. Let's go see the real thing. Now, a few authors did. Robert Crick, who wrote the Civil War weather in Virginia, to his credit, did. And then after we had begun our research, a book came out about environmental during the war, environmental circumstances, weather during the Civil War. Ken No writes a great book. Again, though, not drilling down to the level. And I guess it's because I was where the rubber met the road. People are always asking me, and as I started out mentioning, even my lovely bride, what's the heat index? And I got to know this. So let's go back and let's see about Jacob's original. And then looking at the originals, when I finally did, I realized the sun, in his account, actually had made a small mistake on the weather for the fourth day, the so-called fourth day of the battle. They fight for 3 days, but they glare at one another like wounded animals on July 4th. Well, the weather that's reported in the newspaper article for the 4th is actually the weather for the 5th. Now, I'm glad nothing was wrong with the 1st, 2nd, 3rd in his reporting, but historians would have been using that for 50 years more. So that's why you got to go back. And then Jacob's records for August through December 1863 are missing from the Smithsonian collection, which is with the National Archives. They're missing from NOAA's parallel collection. So where were they? And we're fortunate to locate a duplicate set of Jacob's records. These were probably the records that the Sun had used. And John mentioned APS, and that's where they are. And it has everything except August. So we have, for the first time, a look at the primary source document for November 19th, 1863. Don't know if that rings a bell, but that's when they dedicate the Soldiers National Cemetery, Gettysburg. And a guy you might have heard of, President Abraham Lincoln, comes and delivers the Gettysburg Address that day. So John and I got a couple other things in the works. In due time, we'll get to them. We're looking at August of 1863 because without Jacob's records, we're having to go elsewhere again. But we've got our hands on something, some very severe weather, I think. I could be phrasing that wrong. I've learned from John. Extreme heat, certainly, during August. And then, of course, we'll get into November at some time as well. With time permitting. These semesters are way too long at Penn State. I need to call the chancellor or somebody because I need John back on the job here.
Right,
Well,
right. I was just
that
gonna.
was going to be another question of ours is, are you guys looking at additional, history events or specific time periods for reanalysis and potential future work? So that was a great tie into that question, Jeff.
Right.
I do think there's a lot of potential in using this reanalysis system and maybe taking what we did, sort of the structure that we used to do other work that would be of interest, not just for the Civil War, but for other historical events.
Right. And I was going to actually ask that too. The reanalysis, back into like the early 1800s is kind of where we had, like you said, 1837. Is that right?
It goes back to 1836 now.
It's 36. Is it possible to do the same thing with the Revolutionary War? Or is there just not enough data for that? Because we're talking another like 50 to 70 years before the Civil War.
Right.
Is it possible to even get data and do the same thing?
Well, there are scanty reports of weather that go back that far, but not a lot of people had thermometers.
Mm-hmm.
That might be a task. Never say never when it comes to science and scientific ingenuity.
Right.
That I'd personally be surprised if they extended it back that far. But the bottom line here is to be clear with this reanalysis system. And I know you've forgotten this since you've been out of school for a number of years, but if you have the pressure and you have the pressure tendency, that is the pressure going up or down with time, you can use fundamental meteorological relationships to come up with a lot of other stuff that's going on in the atmosphere, at least a first guess. And that's what this reanalysis system is really based on.
Right.
Observations of pressure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if it wasn't for pressure, we wouldn't really have much. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing is, in the Civil War, there are instances that certainly could be analyzed as far as the weather and how it might have impacted things. So I think there's opportunity for similar research. We kind of built the model. There are other people can go about. The weather observers for the Smithsonian in the South during the Civil War are scant at best, but there are some border state observers. So if you get into looking at campaigns in Tennessee, there are observers not far from Nashville and that type of thing. So certainly summer is where the most emphasis will be. The Cedar Mountain in Virginia in August of 1862. There's a heat wave then. Heat index gets up around 109 during the battle. There are things like that could be looked at further. John's even done a little bit with something called the Mud March. The Mud March in January of 1863,
right,
just outside of Fredericksburg.
And in that case, if I showed you guys as seasoned meteorologists, if I showed you the reanalysis maps that during this thing called the Mud March, and I said to you, look at these maps and give me a weather forecast. What do you think was happening in Virginia at this time? I think the two of you would look at these maps and you would say, I'll just use the terminology, that's cold air damming. And I think there's probably a very cold rain going on in Virginia at that time. And guess what they told us was happening?
Cold rain.
A very cold rain.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's why they called it the Mud
March.
Yeah.
Right. Not only was it just muddy, but it was very cold. Yeah. Like, why isn't it snowing? Well, You know, they probably asked themselves that probably back then. Why wasn't it snowing?
Well,
You know?
Anyway, the point is, I think the reanalysis system has potential.
Right. Well,
That's
this
great.
has
It's
been
interesting. Always interesting
yeah.
to me that you've got the armies combined about 3 million souls fighting in the
Right.
United States Civil War. So there aren't many observers in the South during the war, but you've got a lot of soldiers, and they're all writing about the weather eventually. Not all of them, of course, not every soldier, but when the weather is extreme, whether it's heat or cold, you're going to get more and more accounts than you ever can handle. So it's a chance to have some insights on the weather that we wouldn't otherwise have because of the dearth of observers at the time. The trouble is, then can you quantify it?
Right. Well, I think it's easy when multiple people have very similar accounts, it's easy to kind of credit them. But when one person has a totally different account compared to others, you kind of have to think, well, maybe they're a little bit exaggerating that fact. But of course, like you said, tons of data, tons of stories, and just enough to kind of get a sense for how they felt during the battle. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
well, this has been fun. Jeff and John, thank you so much for
Yes.
joining us here. You know, I
Thank you so
really
much.
enjoyed the book. Truly, I think it's something that, you know, I've read history books, like I said, in the past. And I mean, none have really dived into the weather aspect. And that really just, you know, again, as a meteorologist, I love that. That's really, really great.
Well, thank you for
Yeah.
having us, and thanks
Yeah.
for the kind
Thanks for
words.
having-
Yeah.
Come to
of
the
course.
battlefield with us sometime. We'll do one from the field.
You know,
How's that?
it's funny you mentioned that, Jeff. You know, I was a Boy Scout, and years ago we actually took a trip to Gettysburg. So I mean, I was like maybe 11 years old. So you know, I haven't been there since. Sorry, I do want to go back. But I do remember when I was there. You know, just we did the trail. We actually like marched along where the Union Army marched. And just
Yeah.
seeing everything, you know, from like the same views, the same rock formations, everything what the soldiers would have seen at the time, and now reading this book and kind of understanding, like I think it was also warm that day. I think it was in June or July we went, and it wasn't nearly as hot as just looking at the book. It was warm, but we wouldn't have heat in the seas in the low 100s. So I
Yeah.
can't imagine, but yeah, it's just going back. It's crazy. So I do recommend everyone go there. It's just something that you have to experience yourself.
It gives you. I was there probably 10 or 11 years ago. I have family that lives not too far away, and that was actually a very cold and windy day. As we were like
Wow.
standing on the fields and the wind is whipping, we're like, oh my God, we're freezing. But I think having had the experience, even though it was a while ago, of being there and now reading the book, it's always nice to like kind of that saying, you know, to put a face to a name, of like putting the perspective of being there and experiencing it. You know, as just someone who's interested in history and now reading this book, of kind of getting a picture of the landscape and everything like that. It was really great, really great.
Right.
And
Nice,
very
nice,
appreciative for
nice.
both of you coming on. Very nice meeting you, Jeff and Dr. Nese. It's always great to reconnect.
Yes.
Good to
yes.
see
You as
both.
well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Of
Thank you
course.
very much.
One last thing, just for our listeners, if they want to get a copy of the Weather Gods Curse, the Gettysburg Campaign, where could they go about finding that?
Yes, so they can certainly go online, any number of booksellers out there. We always tell folks History Press has been great to us. That color sections in the book is rare. They don't normally do that. So I'd like people to go to History Press. Certainly Amazon, any of the other ones are out there, Walmart, Target, you name, they're all out there online. If you live close to Gettysburg, it would be great if you came into town and bought from one of the stores in town, and almost all the stores that sell books in town have our book.
Excellent. We'll be sure to include all of these, you know, all the links and everything to these the book, and of course to the Gettysburg Visitor Center down below in the show notes. But again,
Definitely.
gentlemen, thanks so much, John and Jeff, for joining
you.
us here in the Weather Lounge. And Jen, anything else before we end it off here?
I don't think so. I don't think
Okay.
so. I'm just so glad
Excellent.
we got to do this.
I know, I'm excited. So again, thank you so much for everyone listening in to the Weather Lounge. I've been your host, meteorologist Michael Prianti, joined with Jen Diorio. You can listen to the Weather Lounge anywhere you listen to your podcasts. And of course, make sure you follow us on our social platforms, WeatherWorks, on Facebook, Twitter, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and anywhere you see WeatherWorks. So again, for all of us here in the Weather Lounge, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next time.